The morning August Lockhart rode into Salvation Creek. His eyes carried the particular emptiness of a man who had forgotten that the world contained anything worth looking at. It was the spring of 1873, and the town of Salvation Creek sat pressed between the red canyon walls of northern Texas like a coin dropped into a crack in the earth. The main street was unpaved and sun-baked hard as iron, lined on both sides with the kinds of establishments that kept rough men alive and occasionally honest: a feed store, a blacksmith, a saloon that doubled as a hotel when circumstances demanded it, a general goods shop, and a church whose white paint had long since surrendered to the relentless Texas sun. There was also a small land office, a telegraph station, and a doctor who only appeared in town on alternate Tuesdays. It was not a glamorous place. It was not meant to be. It was the kind of town that absorbed grief quietly, the way dry ground absorbs rain. August rode in on a dark bay gelding named Copper, a horse that had seen him through things no horse should have to witness. He was 28 years old, though he looked older in certain kinds of light, lean, and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that had grown too long beneath his hat brim, and a jaw that had not been properly acquainted with a razor in perhaps 2 weeks. His eyes were gray, the particular shade of gray that winter clouds turn just before they decide whether to rain or not. He had a bedroll strapped behind his saddle, a Winchester in the rifle scabbard, and a Colt revolver on his right hip that he had not drawn in anger in 3 months, which was something approaching a personal record for the man he had become since the raid on the Lockhart homestead back in December of 1872. He was not looking for anything in Salvation Creek. That was the honest truth of it. He was passing through, the way he had passed through Abilene and Amarillo, and half a dozen smaller places that no longer appeared on any map. He was moving because stopping felt dangerous, not physically dangerous, but the other kind of dangerous, the kind that involved sitting still long enough to hear your own thoughts clearly. What had happened at the homestead was not something he spoke about. When men in saloons asked where he was from, he said west of somewhere and let his expression do the rest of the discouraging. What he knew was this: the raid had come in December, 3 days before Christmas, led by a gang of outlaws running under the name of the Dorado Crew, men who moved through the Texas territories like a sickness, hitting isolated ranches and homesteads, taking what they pleased, leaving wreckage behind. August had been away from the homestead that night, riding back from selling 3 horses to a rancher 12 miles out. He had come home to find his younger brother Thomas dead on the porch steps, his father badly wounded and unable to speak clearly for 3 days afterward, and everything his family had built over 11 years reduced to ash and memory. His father, Ezra Lockhart, had survived but was broken in the way that old trees break still standing, but wrong inside. August had spent 2 months in a kind of furious motion, riding with the county sheriff's posse, tracking the Dorado Crew across 3 counties before the posse fell apart due to jurisdiction disputes and the general human tendency to prioritize self-preservation over justice. He had not caught them. He had not done anything to balance the scales, and eventually he had found himself simply riding, with no particular direction and no particular purpose. He had not laughed since before the raid. He knew this the way you know something that you have not examined closely in a long time, a general awareness, like knowing a room in your house has furniture in it without being able to describe what the furniture looks like. He had not laughed. He had spoken carefully and quietly when speaking was necessary. He had eaten when food was available. He had slept when exhaustion forced the issue. And he had continued moving because stopping meant feeling things he was not equipped to feel. Laughter was so far removed from his daily experience that it had begun to feel like a foreign language he had once understood, but could no longer quite locate in his memory. He tied Copper to the hitching rail outside the saloon, which bore a painted sign reading Hartley's, and went inside to purchase a meal and a room for the night. He had made enough money doing seasonal ranch work and 1 courier job for the territorial mail service to keep himself in beans and shelter for a few more weeks. He was not destitute, just directionless. The saloon was quiet in the early afternoon hour. Two older men played cards in the corner without enthusiasm. The barkeep, a stout man with an impressive red mustache, introduced himself as Clyde Hartley and told August the meal was 50 cents and the room was 30 cents a night, and that there was a bathhouse out back if he required it, which the barkeep's expression suggested he felt August very much did. August paid for both the meal and the room, accepted the bath suggestion with quiet dignity, and ate his food at the bar, a plate of salt pork, boiled potatoes, and cornbread that was slightly too dry but acceptable. He ate methodically, without pleasure or complaint, and stared at the wall behind the bar where someone had nailed up a newspaper clipping about a cattle drive completed the previous autumn. He slept that night without dreaming, which was either a mercy or a different kind of emptiness, and in the morning he might have simply saddled Copper and continued his directionless journey toward nowhere specific, except that two things happened before he could complete that intention. The first was that Copper threw a shoe. August discovered this when he went to the livery to collect his horse and found the old liveryman, a Mexican man named Domingo who spoke careful and precise English, crouching beside Copper's left foreleg with an expression of professional concern. The shoe had split clean through during the night, possibly from the hard riding of the previous days, and the nail holes had widened. Copper could not be ridden until a new shoe was properly set, and the blacksmith, Domingo, informed August with genuine apology, was currently occupied with an emergency repair on a wagon wheel that had broken on the canyon road and would not be available until midday at the earliest. August stood in the livery doorway and looked at Copper, and then looked at the flat, sun-bright morning outside, and understood that he was staying in Salvation Creek for at least another half-day. The second thing that happened was Belle Conley. He encountered her not at some dramatic moment, not during any event that announced itself as significant. He encountered her at the general goods store, where he had gone to purchase tobacco and a replacement button for his shirt, the original having departed somewhere in the previous week. The store was called Conley's Goods, and the name registered with him only faintly as he pushed through the door into the cool, shadowed interior that smelled of dried herbs and leather, and the particular comfortable mustiness of a well-stocked shop. She was standing behind the counter on a short wooden step stool, reaching up to retrieve a bolt of blue calico from a high shelf, and she was humming to herself, not loudly, not performatively, just the kind of unconscious humming that people do when they are alone and comfortable in their own skin. She had not heard him come in. The bolt of fabric was slightly beyond her reach, and she stretched onto the very tips of her toes, her arm extended fully above her head, her fingers just brushing the edge of the bolt. And then the step stool shifted under her weight, and she wobbled, and she made a small involuntary sound, not quite a squeak, not quite a word, something in between, and grabbed the shelf edge to steady herself, and the bolt of blue calico came free of the shelf and fell directly onto her head. She stood there for a moment, draped in blue calico, the bolt sitting crookedly on top of her auburn hair like the least dignified hat in the history of Texas, and she let out a long breath through her nose, and then she started laughing at herself. It was an entirely ordinary thing, a woman reaching for something on a high shelf, a step stool misbehaving, a bolt of fabric doing what bolts of fabric do when given the opportunity. There was nothing extraordinary about any of it. But August Lockhart, standing in the doorway of Conley's Goods with his hand still on the door frame, felt something move in his chest like a door opening in a house that has been shut up for the winter. And before he could think about it, before he could consider whether it was appropriate or what it meant or how long it had been since such a sound had come from him, he laughed. It was a short laugh, slightly rusty with disuse, nothing like the easy laughter he remembered from before. But it was real, and it rose out of him without his permission. And for a brief, startling moment he felt like himself, some older version of himself that he had been afraid was gone entirely. Belle Conley pulled the bolt of calico off her head, pushed her hair back from her face with both hands, and turned to look at him with an expression of mild surprise and zero embarrassment. She was 24 years old, with the kind of face that had character before it had beauty, though it had both high cheekbones, a straight nose, and amber-brown eyes that were sharp and warm at the same time. She was dressed practically: a dark blue dress, work boots, a white apron that had seen a morning's worth of work already. "I hope you enjoyed that," she said, and her voice was dry but her eyes were amused. "I apologize," August said, which was not entirely true, because he did not entirely feel sorry. "Don't," she said, climbing down from the step stool with the calico bolt under her arm. "It was funny. I would have laughed at someone else doing it. Can I help you find something?" He told her about the button and the tobacco. She found both without difficulty, moving through the shop with the ease of someone who knew exactly where everything lived. The button was a good match, dark brown bone, and the tobacco was the same cut he preferred. He paid for both and should have left, except that she was already reaching for a ledger on the counter and asking him, with the matter-of-fact curiosity of someone who came through her town, how long he was planning to stay. "Half a day," he said. "My horse threw a shoe. You're at the livery with Domingo?" "Yes." "He's good," she said, writing something in her ledger. "And Hector at the smithy is better than good, but he'll make you wait until he's ready regardless of how you feel about it." She looked up. "You passing through?" "Yes." She studied him for a moment with those amber-brown eyes, and he had the uncomfortable sensation that she was reading something in him that he had not intended to display. But she did not press. She simply said, "Well, we have a decent place to eat down the road if you're hungry. Mary Ashton does breakfast until noon. Better than Hartley's." "I stayed at Hartley's." "I know," she said, and returned to her ledger. "The walls are thin and you asked for an extra blanket." He was not sure whether to be amused or unsettled by the fact that news traveled this efficiently in a town this small. He settled for slightly amused, which was already more than he had managed in some time, and thanked her and left. But he went to Mary Ashton's for breakfast, because he had nowhere else to be, and the food was indeed better than Hartley's eggs done properly, biscuits that had been made by someone who cared about biscuits, and coffee strong enough to be useful. He was on his second cup when Belle Conley came in, her apron removed and her hair pinned more neatly than it had been in the shop, carrying a small cloth bag that she set on the counter while she greeted Mary Ashton with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance. She glanced at Auguste's table without apparent surprise, as though she had known he would be there, which possibly she had given the size of the town and the limited dining options. "How's the coffee?" she asked, stopping beside his table. "Adequate," he said. "That's the highest praise Mary gets on the coffee," she said. "She'll be pleased." She tilted her head slightly. "I'm Belle Conley. My family runs the goods store." "August Lockhart," she nodded, as though confirming something she had already suspected. "Where are you from, August Lockhart?" "West of somewhere," he said, which was his standard answer. She considered this. "That's a large territory," she said, with a small smile that suggested she understood exactly what kind of answer she had been given and had chosen not to argue with it. "Well, safe travels when your horse is ready." She collected her things from the counter. She had come to pick up a parcel Mary was keeping for her, some dry goods she had ordered through the mail, and left with the brisk purpose of someone who had a shop to run and a day to get through. August sat with his coffee and looked at the space she had occupied and felt the strange sensation of noticing another person, really noticing them, for the first time in months. Not as a potential threat, not as a source of information, not as a distraction from the constant low-frequency hum of grief and rage that had accompanied him since December, but as a person, specific and present and interesting. It was a small thing. He filed it away carefully and went back to his coffee. Hector the blacksmith did not finish the wagon wheel repair until past noon, and by the time he set Copper's new shoe it was mid-afternoon, and August, looking at the angle of the sun, made the practical decision that starting out in the late afternoon toward the next town, which Domingo had told him was 40 miles west and not an easy 40 miles, was not sensible. He would leave in the morning. He ate supper at Hartley's, which confirmed Belle's assessment that Mary Ashton's was the superior establishment, and sat on the saloon porch afterward watching the street settle into its evening rhythms, men coming in from the ranches, a family in a wagon heading toward the North Road, two boys chasing a dog down the main street with more enthusiasm than result. Belle came out of Conley's goods at around 6 in the evening, locking the door behind her with the specific efficient manner of someone ending a long workday. She carried a basket on her arm and walked with the particular stride of a woman who knew exactly where she was going and saw no reason to hurry unnecessarily. She glanced at the saloon porch as she passed, and when she saw August sitting there with his coffee cup, Hartley had coffee, at least she stopped. "You're still here. My horse needed a new shoe properly set. Hector didn't finish until 4. "That sounds like Hector," she said with a tone of fond exasperation. "Are you leaving in the morning?" "I am." She seemed to consider something for a moment. Then she said, with the directness that he was beginning to understand was simply how she communicated, "My father is making dinner tonight. He always makes too much. You're welcome to join us if you'd rather not eat at Hartley's again." He should have declined. He was leaving in the morning, and there was no particular logic in accepting dinner invitations from people in towns you were passing through. But he looked at her standing in the evening light with her basket on her arm, and he thought about another plate of Hartley's salt pork, and he said, "That's very kind. Thank you." Belle's father was a man named George Conley, 60 years old and built like a barrel that had decided to become a person broad and solid and slightly weathered, with a white beard and the hands of a man who had done physical work for 4 decades. He had come to Texas from Missouri with his wife 26 years ago, built the goods store from nothing, and raised Belle and her 2 older brothers, both of whom had since moved on, one to work the cattle trail up to Kansas, one to apprentice with a lawyer in Dallas. His wife, Martha Conley, had died of fever 4 years ago, which Belle had told August in the matter-of-fact way that people in this time and place delivered difficult information, as a piece of necessary context rather than an invitation to prolonged sympathy. George Conley welcomed August into his home, which was attached to the back of the store, with the uncomplicated hospitality of a man who liked people and saw no reason not to feed them. The dinner was substantial roasted chicken that Belle had been preparing most of the day, cornbread, beans, and a wild plum preserve that George produced with visible pride. "Made it myself," George said, setting the jar on the table. "Belle won't tell you that. She'll be modest about it. But I've been making that preserve since 1859, and it has never been bettered." "It hasn't been bettered," Belle confirmed, without modesty, simply as a statement of fact, and August found himself smiling. Not the polished social smile he used when social smiling was required, but the smaller, more honest kind that came without planning. George asked August the usual questions. Where was he from? Where was he going? And accepted the limited answers without pushing, in the way of a man who had run a good store long enough to understand that people had their reasons for what they shared and what they kept. He talked about Salvation Creek, about the cattle industry changing the character of the region, about the railroad that everyone said was coming, and that George believed would either save the town or ruin it depending on how it was handled. August listened and ate, and participated in the conversation to the degree that he was able, which was more than he had managed in months. Belle contributed precisely and with humor. She had opinions about the railroad, which she expressed clearly, and about the quality of the territorial governor's decisions, which she expressed less diplomatically but no less clearly. She had read more widely than most women August had encountered in small Texas towns, and she was not shy about the fact. "My mother believed in reading," Belle said, when August noted she had referenced a newspaper article about cattle prices that he had not expected her to have read. She said knowing things was the only form of independence that nobody could take away from you. There was a pause, And then George said quietly, "She was right about most things, Martha." Belle looked at her father with an expression that held a great deal love and grief, and the long familiarity of shared loss, and then she looked back at the table and said, "Yes, she was," in a voice that was steady but carried weight. August recognized that particular weight. He sat with it respectfully and said nothing, and felt the evening's warmth settle around the three of them like something real. He thanked them when he left, and meant it sincerely, and shook George's hand and told Belle it was the best meal he had eaten in some months, which was true. She walked him to the door with a candle, which she held up against the night because the street was dark, and at the door she said, "I hope the road is good to you, August Lockhart," with a tone that carried neither sentiment nor dismissal but something careful and genuine that sat somewhere between the two. "Thank you," he said, "for all of it." He went back to Hartley's and lay on the narrow bed in his room and looked at the ceiling for a long time before sleeping. He got up before dawn and saddled Copper and prepared to leave. He told himself this was correct. He was passing through. He had nothing to offer anyone in this town or any other town. His father was back east of Abilene in a house that felt wrong now without Thomas in it, and the men who had made it wrong were still somewhere in the territory. And August he sat on Copper in the livery doorway and looked at the pink edge of dawn coming up over the canyon wall. And he knew, with the clarity of a man who is being honest with himself after a long time of being otherwise, that he did not want to leave. He sat with that knowledge for a long time. Then he rode Copper slowly out of the livery, and he turned left instead of right. Left toward Conley's goods, which was not yet open, the shutters still drawn. He tied Copper to the rail and sat on the bench outside and waited. He was not certain what he was waiting for. He only knew that he was not ready to point himself west again. Belle arrived at her store at 7 in the morning, as apparently she always did, and found him sitting on the bench with his hat in his hands and his horse tied to the rail, and she stopped on the boardwalk and looked at him with an expression that was impossible to read clearly. "You're not leaving," she said. It was not a question. "I was going to," he said, and then he looked at the hat in his hands. "I turned left instead of right." She looked at him for another moment and then she unlocked the door. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." It was not a declaration. It was not an invitation freighted with expectation or complicated meaning. It was simply a woman opening her shop and offering coffee to a person sitting outside it, which was the kind of ordinary thing that ordinary mornings in small towns produced without fanfare or ceremony. But August got up and followed her inside, and something about the act of following someone through a door into a warm, familiar-smelling room felt like the first right thing he had done in a very long time. He stayed in Salvation Creek. He did not announce this as a permanent decision, because he was not sure it was permanent. He rented a room at Hartley's on a weekly basis, which Clyde Hartley accepted with the equanimity of a man who had learned not to ask too many questions about what brought people to his establishment or kept them there. August found work within 3 days. He was a good hand with horses, which was the kind of skill that Texas in 1873 found immediately useful, and a rancher named Coleman Briggs, who ran cattle on a spread 6 miles east of town, hired him on for seasonal work. The pay was fair. The work was demanding and physical and blessedly simple in its requirements, which suited August's current need to be occupied without being required to feel complicated things. He returned to Salvation Creek each evening, and in the evenings, more often than not, he found reasons to walk past Conley's goods. Sometimes the reasons were practical. He needed something from the store, or he was passing by on his way to Mary Ashton's for supper, or he was simply walking the street in the way that men in small towns do when they have energy to burn and nowhere specific to burn it. Sometimes the reasons were less practical, and he was honest enough with himself to know it. Belle was consistent, which was something August valued without quite knowing how much until he encountered it. She opened her shop at 7 and closed it at 6, Monday through Saturday. She kept precise records, and she knew her inventory without consulting it, and she had a reputation in Salvation Creek for fair dealing that August heard referenced multiple times by multiple people, with the matter-of-fact respect that is the most genuine kind of praise. She read the weekly territorial newspaper from cover to cover and had opinions about everything in it. She made plum preserve with her father on Sunday afternoons. She was also, August observed over the course of 2 weeks, quietly remarkable in ways that did not announce themselves. The way she remembered which of her regular customers preferred which cut of cloth and set it aside for them without being asked. The way she gave credit to a young widow named Eliza Marsh without mentioning it to anyone, and August only knew because Eliza had told him with transparent and genuine gratitude. The way she talked to old Domingo at the livery with real interest in what he said, and did not talk over him or rush him, which August had noticed that a significant portion of the white residents of Salvation Creek did not manage. He began stopping at the store more deliberately. He found reasons that were increasingly transparent even to himself: a new pair of work gloves, a length of rope, a particular sort of tin that he needed for nothing specific but that he noticed on a shelf and decided he required. Belle sold him everything without comment on the frequency of his visits, but there was a quality to her expression during these transactions that August could not entirely interpret, an attentiveness that might have been the natural attentiveness of a good shopkeeper, or might have been something else, and he did not yet trust himself to tell the difference. On a Tuesday evening 3 weeks after his arrival, he came in at 5:30 with a genuine need, a broken buckle on his saddle bag that he needed replaced, and found the shop unexpectedly crowded. 3 women were examining fabric bolts and discussing a community event that August gathered was a church social planned for the following Saturday. Belle was helping all 3 simultaneously with impressive efficiency, and August waited by the counter. He was idly examining a display of pocket knives when he heard one of the women, a large, cheerful person named Mrs. Patricia Downing, who seemed to be the social hub of Salvation Creek's female population, say to Belle in a carrying voice that was clearly designed to be carried, "And how is your Mr. Lockhart settling in, dear?" There was a brief pause. "He's not my Mr. Lockhart," Belle said pleasantly, folding a length of yellow muslin with expert hands. "He comes in here every other day," Mrs. Downing said. "He's a good customer," Belle said, with a tone that closed the subject without being rude about it, which was impressive. August set down the pocket knife and looked at the wall until the 3 women completed their purchases and left. Then he carried his broken buckle to the counter, and Belle looked at it and then looked at him with an expression that contained genuine amusement and something else. "Patricia Downing," she said, "means well." "I'm sure," he said. Belle found a replacement buckle in the hardware section without difficulty and set it on the counter. She named a price and he paid it, and then he did not immediately leave and she did not immediately return to her ledger. "August," she said after a moment, "Belle, is there something else you need, or are you just standing there?" He considered a number of responses and discarded most of them. "I was wondering," he said, "if you might want to walk out to the canyon overlook sometime." "I've been told the view is good." She looked at him steadily. "Who told you that?" "Domingo." She nodded slowly, as though evaluating the quality of this information source. "Domingo is correct," she said. "The view is good." She paused. "Sunday afternoon my father and I do the plum preserve. Saturday morning I'm at the store until noon." She met his eyes with the directness that was simply her nature. "Saturday afternoon." "Saturday afternoon," he said. He left with his buckle and the particular light-chested feeling of a man who has committed to something and is not frightened of it. He was, in fact, slightly frightened of it, but in a way that felt different from fear and closer to being alive. He told himself that evening, sitting on the saloon porch with his coffee, that he needed to be honest. He needed to be honest with himself, and if things progressed, honest with Belle about who he was and what had happened, and why he had ended up in Salvation Creek with a broken horseshoe and a broken life. He had been holding the story of the raid like a coal too hot to put down, too painful to examine. But he understood, in the same way he had understood that turning left instead of right was correct, that carrying things alone had costs that eventually could not be borne. The canyon overlook was 3 miles east of town along a trail that wound up through the red rock country and arrived at a limestone shelf that jutted over the canyon, providing a view of 40 miles in 3 directions that was, as Domingo had promised, genuinely remarkable. August and Belle made the ride in the comfortable silence of two people who did not feel the need to fill space with sound. She rode a sorrel mare named Penny, who moved with the smooth economy of a well-trained horse, and August rode Copper, and the afternoon light was turning golden and long-shadowed by the time they reached the overlook. They tied the horses to a scrub oak and walked to the edge of the shelf and stood together looking at the canyon below, the red and orange layers of the rock, the thin silver thread of a creek far below, the vast Texas sky beginning to shift from blue to something richer at its western edge. "This is the thing about this country," Belle said after several minutes of quiet. "It doesn't care what you're going through. It just keeps being beautiful regardless." "Is that comforting or unsettling?" August asked. She thought about it. "Both," she said honestly. "My mother died here, this town, that same sky, and it was still beautiful the next morning, which was very nearly unbearable." She paused, and also eventually I think it helped, knowing that some things were just going to keep going regardless. August was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My brother died in December, and my family's homestead was burned." Belle turned to look at him. She did not say the things that people usually said, the reflexive condolences, the questions about whether justice had been served. She simply looked at him with those amber-brown eyes that were sharp and warm and full of something that was not pity but was perhaps its older and more dignified cousin. "What was his name?" she said. "Thomas. He was 23. August looked at the canyon. He laughed easily. That was the thing about him. You could not keep a serious conversation going with Thomas for more than 5 minutes before he found something to be amused by. It drove me half to madness when we were younger. He was quiet. I would give a great deal to be driven half to madness by it right now." Belle sat down on the rock shelf, drawing her knees up, looking at the view. "How long have you been riding?" "Since February." 4 months, she said. "Yes. And where are you going?" He sat down near her on the shelf, close but not presumptuous. "I don't know," he said, which was the truest thing he had said to anyone in a long time. "I've been telling myself I'm going to find the men who did it, but the sheriff's posse dissolved in January and the county has bigger concerns than a homestead raid, apparently." His voice was controlled, but the words had an edge. "And the honest truth is that I've been riding to keep from sitting still. Because sitting still means feeling it," she said quietly. "Yes." She nodded, looking at the canyon, as though she was considering the mathematics of grief and finding them familiar. "I rode every single day for a month after my mother died," she said. "Not to anywhere, just out and back. My father thought I was scouting for something. He only figured it out when I came home one evening and went straight to the kitchen and cried for 2 hours without stopping." "What did he do?" "Made tea," she said, "and sat with me. He didn't say anything. He's very good at sitting with things without trying to fix them." August thought about his own father, back east of Abilene in a house full of absence, and felt the familiar tightening in his chest that was grief without enough room to move. "My father isn't as good at that," he said. "He wants to act. He always has. When things went wrong on the ranch, he fixed them. When Thomas and I were hurt as boys, he patched us up and put us back. He doesn't know what to do with something that can't be patched. Do you?" He looked at her. "Not yet," he said honestly. They sat there on the limestone shelf with the canyon spread below them and the sky burning itself out in shades of amber and crimson at the western horizon, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people have said enough true things to each other that pretense would feel like a step backward. On the ride back, Belle's horse Penny spooked at a jackrabbit that came bursting out of a mesquite bush, and Penny shied sideways and nearly put Belle into a thorny stand of scrub cedar. And Belle brought her back with steady hands and calm authority and said afterward to the horse, with exasperation, "Penny, it was a rabbit. You weigh 1,100 pounds." And then looked at August with an expression of dignified frustration, and August laughed, the second time in 3 weeks, and fuller than the first, more itself, and Belle's dignified frustration transitioned into amusement, and she laughed too. And they rode back to Salvation Creek in the long evening light feeling like people who had, somehow, come to an understanding without the words for it yet. The weeks passed and became a month, and August remained in Salvation Creek and found that this felt less like an accident and more like a choice each day. He worked for Coleman Briggs during the week and spent his evenings and weekends in the town, and his time in the town increasingly organized itself around Belle Conley, the way water organizes itself around a stone not forced, but natural. They ate supper together at Mary Ashton's on Wednesday evenings, which became a habit without either of them formally proposing it. They walked the evening streets when the heat permitted. He helped her carry heavy supply deliveries when they arrived at the store, which she accepted with practical gratitude and no fuss. She brought him plum preserve from her Sunday sessions with her father, arriving at Hartley's on Sunday evenings with a small jar, and the manner of someone completing a completely unremarkable errand, and August thanked her with a formality that made her eyes crinkle. George Conley watched all of this with the benign attentiveness of a man who had raised a daughter, and understood her well enough to know when she was invested in something, and wise enough not to say so out loud. He had taken a clear liking to August, which was mutual. August found him to be one of the more straightforwardly decent men he had met in some time, with a humor that was dry and well-timed, and a generosity that was genuine rather than performed. One evening in early June, August arrived at the store to walk Belle to supper, and found her in a quiet argument with a man he had not seen before, a heavy-set man with a reddish beard, and the particular air of someone who believed his size was an argument in itself. He was standing at the counter demanding a price adjustment on a quantity of rope he had purchased the previous week, claiming the rope was inferior, which Belle was disputing with calm specificity. "The rope is the same quality we have stocked for 3 years, Mr. Harner," she was saying when August came in. "If it frayed, it was mishandled." "Now listen here," Harner said, leaning on the counter in a way that was designed to be physically imposing. "I have been a customer of this store since before your father." "Since before I started running this store," Belle said evenly. "And in that time we have sold you rope on 4 occasions and you have brought it back twice, on both occasions claiming defect. The rope is good. The price stands." Harner's face reddened. He straightened and looked like he was deciding whether to escalate this, and then he noticed August standing by the door, which August had positioned himself in a way that was not aggressive but was deliberate. The two men looked at each other for a moment. Harner looked back at Belle and seemed to recalculate something in his assessment of the situation. "Fine," he said, in a tone that blamed her for the weather and everything else. "But I'll be taking my business elsewhere." "You're welcome to," Belle said pleasantly. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harner." He left with his rope and his grievance, and August remained by the door until the sound of the man's boots on the boardwalk faded, and then he looked at Belle, who was making a note in her ledger with the focused expression of someone who has already finished with a conversation and moved on. "Does that happen often?" he asked. "Occasionally," she said. "Men who believe that size is a persuasive argument. I find specificity tends to be a better one." She closed the ledger. "Are you ready?" They walked to Mary Ashton's and ate supper, and afterward in the cooling June evening they walked west along the main street past the church to the edge of town where the road opened up and the prairie stretched out big and silent under the stars, and they stood at the edge of things and looked at the sky. "Can I ask you something?" Belle said. "Yes." "Do you want to stay here, in Salvation Creek, I mean, not just this week or next week? Do you want to stay?" He looked at the stars. He had been thinking about this. He had been thinking about little else for the past week, in the way that a man thinks about something he already knows the answer to, but needs time to trust the answer. "Yes," he said, "I think I do." She was quiet for a moment. The nighthawks were out, wheeling against the deep blue of the sky. "I think I would like it if you did," she said, which was Belle's way of saying a great deal, and he understood it as such. He turned to look at her in the starlight, at the specific geography of her face that had become, over the course of 2 months, as familiar to him as anything he knew. "Belle," he said. "August," she said in the same tone, and there was a small smile at the corner of her mouth. "I want to be honest with you about something," he said. "All right. I came here broken," he said. "I want you to know that because I think you deserve to know what you're dealing with. I'm not the same man I was before the raid. I don't know if I'll ever entirely be him again. I'm still working out what's left and what isn't." He paused. "And I think you're one of the most remarkable people I've ever had the good fortune to encounter, and I don't want to misrepresent myself to you." Belle was quiet for a moment, looking at the prairie. Then she said, "I know you came here broken, August. I don't need you to be whole. I think that's not how it works anyway with people. I think people are always in process." She turned to look at him. "I like who you are. The person who turned left instead of right. The person who laughs at a woman getting a bolt of calico dropped on her head. A slight pause. The person who tells me true things." He reached out and took her hand, which fit in his the way that makes you wonder afterward how you managed to carry things without it. She did not pull away. She looked at their joined hands and then looked up at him and said nothing, which was also a kind of answer. He kissed her that evening gently, carefully, with the quality of someone treating something valuable. She kissed him back with the decisiveness that was purely Belle Conley, as if she had made up her mind and saw no reason to be tentative about it. They walked back to Conley's goods hand in hand, and at the door she said good night with a quality of warmth in her voice that he carried back to Hartley's and kept him awake in the best possible way. July in North Texas was the kind of heat that asked serious questions of everyone, and August Lockhart answered it by working harder than he had worked in years and finding that it suited him. Coleman Briggs was a fair employer who recognized good work and compensated it appropriately, and by mid-July he had offered August a foreman position, which came with a wage increase and a small bunkhouse room of his own on the ranch property if he wanted it. August thanked him and said he would consider it, which he did, and the consideration involved a conversation with Belle. They were sitting on the bench outside Conley's goods in the early evening. She had closed up for the day and he had come in from the ranch, and he told her about the offer and she listened without interrupting, which was something he appreciated about her. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to stay in town," he said. "If I'm on the ranch full time, I lose the evenings here." He was looking at the street as he said this, with the slight awkwardness of a man saying something true and knowing it is transparent. Belle looked at the side of his face. "August Lockhart," she said, "you can just say you want to see me in the evenings." He turned to look at her and she was smiling, the full smile that she did not deploy constantly but which, when it appeared, had the quality of sunlight on water. "I want to see you in the evenings," he said. "Then stay in town," she said. "You can still work for Briggs and come in at evening. Plenty of hands do it." He did. He declined the foreman position. Briggs was disappointed but understanding, and kept his room at Hartley's and his work schedule and his evenings in Salvation Creek. And August Lockhart, who had arrived in the spring with nothing but a grief he couldn't process and a horse with a bad shoe, found himself building something that felt like a life. The church social on a Saturday in July was the kind of community event that small towns in the West organized with earnest enthusiasm, music provided by 3 fiddle players, long tables of food contributed by the various households, children underfoot, older men discussing cattle and weather, women exchanging the dense social information that kept communities functional. August went because Belle asked him, and he stood at the edges initially with the slight tension of a man unaccustomed to social events. But George Conley found him within 10 minutes, and steered him into a conversation about horses that lasted an hour and involved 4 other ranchers and was genuinely interesting. And by the time the dancing started, August had shaken enough hands and discussed enough subjects to have passed from stranger to familiar face in the social calculus of Salvation Creek. Belle danced with him twice, which was enough to be clear but not enough to be scandalous, and she danced well, with the same combination of precision and ease that characterized everything she did, and August, who had not danced in years, found that his feet remembered what his mind had not been thinking about. "You're better at this than you looked," she said, during the second dance, which was a slower piece. "I'm full of hidden qualities," he said gravely, and she laughed the open laugh that he had first witnessed when the calico fell on her head, which remained the sound that had started something moving in him. And he felt it again, that opening, the sensation of the world containing things worth being present for. After the social, walking back through the summer-warm night, Belle tucked her hand in the crook of his arm with the natural ease of someone who had decided that this was where it belonged, and August covered her hand with his, and they walked without speaking past the shuttered shops and the church with its lit windows and the livery where Domingo had gone to bed 2 hours ago. "My father likes you," Belle said. "I like him. He doesn't make that easy with everyone. He's friendly with everyone, but not everyone gets the good version of him. You get the good version. He's a good man." "He is," she said simply. "The best I know." She paused. "He thinks you're staying." "He's right," August said. She looked up at him in the dark. "Is that certain?" He stopped walking, which stopped her. He turned to face her, and in the thin starlight she was looking at him with the combination of directness and carefulness that was purely her, the steady amber gaze that had seen through him from the first morning in the store. "Belle," he said, "I'm more certain about staying in this town near you than I have been about anything since before December. I know that I came here broken, and I know there are things I still need to work through, and I know I am not the easiest man. But I am asking if that's what this is." He paused. "I'm asking where we are." She was quiet for a moment that felt long. Then she said, "We are exactly where I think we both know we are, and I am glad of it." He put his hand against her face, and she turned into it slightly, and he kissed her there in the middle of the empty street with the stars overhead and Texas spread in all directions around them, and she kissed him back with all of the certainty that she possessed, which was considerable. The matter of the Dorado crew came back to August in August, the month, not the man, though the timing felt pointed, when a territorial marshal named Bose Hollies arrived in Salvation Creek on a sweating horse with a warrant and a story. Marshal Hollies was a black man in his 40s, one of the Bass Reeves type of frontier lawman who had built a reputation through competence and sheer determined force of will against considerable resistance. He was lean and precise in speech, with eyes that assessed everything in a room simultaneously, and he had been tracking the Dorado crew across 4 counties on a mandate from the territorial government that had finally decided the gang's activities constituted enough of a regional problem to be worth official attention. He came into Hartley's that evening and asked for August Lockhart by name, which Clyde Hartley provided after one look at the marshal's badge, and Hollies found August at the bar eating supper and introduced himself with direct efficiency. "I know about your homestead," Hollies said, "and your brother. I'm sorry for it. I need to know what you know." They talked for 2 hours. August told him everything. The night of the raid, as his father had been able to reconstruct it, the direction the Dorado crew had taken, what he had learned during the weeks he had ridden with the sheriff's posse, the names of the men he had been able to identify through description. Hollies listened and took careful notes in a small book and asked precise questions. He was, August thought, the first lawman who had treated the matter with the seriousness it deserved. "I have warrants for 6 of them," Hollies said at the end. "I have intelligence that puts them in Garza County as of 2 weeks ago. I am going to get them, Mr. Lockhart." "Do you need another man?" August said, which came out before he had processed the question. Hollies looked at him steadily. "Are you asking to ride with me?" The old response, The one from the months of riding and rage wanted to say yes. But August sat in Hartley's saloon in the town where Belle Conley made plum preserve on Sundays and walked with him in the evening streets and thought about what he was building and what he would risk and what Thomas would actually want for him. "No," he said after a moment. "No, I'm asking if you need information, which I've given you. That's all I can offer." Hollis nodded, and it was the nod of a man who understood exactly what that answer had cost and respected it. "That's all I need," he said. "The rest is my job." Hollis left the next morning, and August stood at the edge of Salvation Creek, watching him ride out, and felt the complex weight of having let something go, not the grief, which did not leave, but the compulsive need to pursue it personally, to make himself the instrument of justice when that was not his role to play. He stood there until the marshal was a dust cloud on the eastern road, and then he turned around and walked to Conley's Goods, which was open for business. Belle was at the counter with a customer when he came in, and she glanced up and registered him with her eyes in the brief specific way she had, the way that communicated that she had noted him and was glad he was there and would give him her full attention as soon as she was free, and August waited, looking at the shelves, until the customer left. "The marshal," she said. He had told her about Hollis's arrival the night before. "Rode out this morning," August said. "He has enough. He knows where they are." "And you?" She said. "I'm here," he said. She looked at him for a moment, reading whatever she read in him. Then she came around the counter and took his hand and held it, which was what he needed more than anything she could have said, and she held it for a long, quiet minute without speaking, and that was that. 3 weeks later, a telegraph arrived from Marshal Hollis. 4 members of the Dorado crew had been apprehended in Garza County. 2 had resisted arrest and been killed. The remaining 2 had surrendered and were being transported to stand trial in Lubbock. The telegram was addressed to August Lockhart through the Salvation Creek telegraph office, and the operator, a young man named Willis, brought it to the ranch with visible curiosity that he admirably suppressed. August read it twice. He sat for a long time in the bunkhouse with the telegram in his hands. He thought about Thomas, easy-laughing Thomas, who had found something amusing in every serious conversation, who had died on the porch steps of the home their family had built over 11 years, who was 23 years old and never got to be 24. August cried, which was something he had not done since the first night after coming home to find the wreckage, and doing it now felt like something releasing that had been held too long. A pressure valve finally turned. He sat in the bunkhouse until he was done, and then he washed his face and rode into town. He went to the store. Belle took one look at him and told the shop there were 2 customers browsing that she would be back in 5 minutes, and she steered August out the back door into the small garden behind the store where she grew herbs and a climbing rose that had survived 3 Texas summers through sheer will, and she said, "Tell me." He told her. She listened to all of it, the telegram, what it meant, what he had thought about in the bunkhouse, all of it. She stood in the afternoon sun in her herb garden with her arms crossed and her eyes steady, and she listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "How does it feel?" "Like something being finished," he said. "And like it doesn't bring Thomas back, which I knew but needed to feel." "I know," she said softly. "I want to write to my father," he said. I think I need to go back and see him." She nodded. "You should. How long has it been?" "Since February." "That's too long," she said, without accusation, simply as assessment. "You should go. When do you want to leave?" He looked at her, this woman in her garden, with her steady eyes and her practical heart, and the particular quality of presence that made him feel like the world was solid under his feet. 2 weeks, he said. "I need to arrange things with Briggs, and I'll be gone maybe 3 weeks, maybe a month." "I'll be here," she said. He took her face in both his hands and she looked up at him, and he said, "I know," with a feeling behind it that was everything. He wrote to his father that evening, a long letter, the longest thing he had written in years, that tried to do the impossible work of crossing 8 months of silence. He told Ezra Lockhart about the marshal and the telegram. He told him about Salvation Creek and Coleman Briggs and Mary Ashton's cooking, and the canyon overlook and George Conley's plum preserve. He told him about Belle, not with the detailed accounting of a man asking permission, but with the honesty of a man describing something that mattered. He told him he was coming. He rode out of Salvation Creek 2 weeks later in the early morning, and Belle stood at the edge of town on Penny's back to see him off, because she had insisted on riding out to the main road with him rather than saying goodbye at the shop, which she said was too ordinary for the occasion. They sat their horses at the junction of the main road and looked at each other in the dawn light. "August," she said. "Belle. Come back in good health," she said, "and bring your father's opinion of my plum preserve, because George is convinced it's the best in the territory, and I think that requires independent verification." He laughed fully, warmly, entirely himself, and she smiled at the sound of it with something luminous in her face, and he reached over from his saddle and she leaned toward him and he kissed her once, solid and real. "I'll be back," he said. "I know you will," she said. He rode east. The journey to his father's place took 4 days, through country he had not seen in 9 months, and arrived feeling different than any return he had made before, not coming back to something broken, but coming back to something that still existed and needed him to see it. Ezra Lockhart was smaller than August remembered, which was the effect grief had on people. It compressed them somehow, made them take up less space. He was 62 years old with his son's gray eyes and a white beard and hands that had done 50 years of hard work and had not yet stopped. He opened the door of the rebuilt house. He had rebuilt it, August saw, without help, with the dogged competence of a man who would not be defeated, and looked at his son for a long moment on the porch. Then he said, "You look better than I expected. You look smaller than I remembered," August said. "I always was smaller than you remembered," Ezra said, which was the dry humor that August had forgotten his father possessed, buried under everything. "Come inside." They spent 4 days together. Ezra had read August's letter 3 times, which he admitted without embarrassment. They talked about Thomas in the way you talk about someone beloved when the acute edge of the grief has worn down enough to permit specific memory. The fishing trips. The time Thomas had talked a rancher out of his best horse through nothing but charm and persistence. The Christmas before the raid when he had sung every carol he knew in deliberately wrong keys, until their mother's portrait on the wall seemed like it might start laughing. They talked about the telegram, and Ezra sat with it quietly for a long time and then said, "Good," which contained a great deal, and August understood all of it. He told his father about Belle, and Ezra listened with the attentiveness of a man who was hearing something important. "This woman," Ezra said, "ran into a bolt of calico and laughed at herself." "She did. And you laughed." "I did." Ezra was quiet. Then he said, "Thomas would have found that very funny." "He would have," August said. "He would have told the story for weeks." They were quiet together for a moment that was full of grief and also of something warmer, the way good memory and grief sometimes coexist when enough time has passed. "Bring her to meet me sometime," Ezra said, "when it's right." "I intend to," August said. He stayed 5 days instead of 4, because there was more to say than he had estimated, and because his father needed him present for a portion of it in a way that August had not understood until he was there. He helped repair a section of fence that had come down in a spring storm, and he cooked breakfast 3 mornings because his father's cooking had never improved, and he saw no reason for them both to suffer it. And on his last evening there, they sat on the rebuilt porch and watched the Texas dusk come in over the plains, and were simply 2 men who had lost the same people, and were figuring out how to carry it. "Are you happy?" Ezra asked, which was not a question his father typically asked. August thought about it. "I'm getting there," he said honestly. "I think I'm getting there." His father nodded, and that was enough. He rode back to Salvation Creek in 3 days instead of 4, pushing harder than necessary, which he did not examine too closely. He arrived on a Wednesday evening as the town was settling toward supper hour, and he rode directly to Conley's goods, which was closed, and then to the Conley house at the back of the store and knocked. George Conley opened the door and his face split into a genuine smile. "August," he said, with a warmth that was entirely unperformed. "Come in." "Belle's in the kitchen." August came through the door and Belle appeared from the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on a cloth, and stopped. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that he could read now: relief and pleasure and something else that was particular to her. "You're back early," she said. "Yes," he said. "How is your father?" "Better than I expected," he said. "He rebuilt the house himself." She nodded, reading him. "And you?" He crossed the room to her, which was a short distance but felt like the right direction, and she let him take her hands, and he said, "My father says to bring you to meet him. He wants independent verification of your Plum Preserve's territorial claims." She laughed bright and full and said, "What did you tell him about the preserve?" "That it was excellent." "I'll need to do better than excellent if I'm being evaluated," she said. "You are terrifying to underestimate," he said. She looked up at him with those amber-brown eyes that he had been seeing in his mind for the 3 weeks he had been away, and she said, "Welcome back, August Lockhart," with all the warmth in the world. George from the other room said, "There's enough food for 3, whenever you're ready," with the tact of a man who understood when people needed a moment and when they needed food, and who had correctly assessed that both applied here. The autumn came slowly to North Texas, the heat breaking at last in late September into something more moderate, and Salvation Creek prepared for the winter season with the busy purpose of a community that understood what cold and isolation required. August had continued working for Briggs through the fall roundup, which was the most demanding season on the ranch, and had earned the respect of the other hands and the permanent goodwill of Briggs himself. He had also, in October, gone to see George Conley, not about Plum Preserve. George listened to him with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, seated in the armchair in the back room of the store on a Sunday afternoon, and August said what he had come to say, that he loved Belle with the kind of certainty that did not require more time to be certain, that he understood he had arrived in Salvation Creek less than 6 months ago, and he was aware that this might seem fast to a father, and that he was not asking for anything other than George's blessing if George felt he could give it. George was quiet for a moment, looking at the floor. Then he looked up at August with his daughter's eyes, the same amber brown, the same sharpness, and said, "I've watched you with her for 5 months. I watched you not leave when you had every reason to. I watched you go back to your father when you needed to and come back here when you were done." He paused. "I watched her last week when you rode in, and I know my daughter's face." He stood up and extended his hand. August took it. "You have my blessing," George said. "Now you just have to ask her. And I'll tell you that she is not a woman who does well with unnecessary ceremony, but she is a woman who does well with honesty, which I think you already know." August had thought about this carefully. He was not a man for grand gestures, they had never suited him, and he had been right to assess that Belle would find them bewildering rather than romantic. What she valued was the real thing, said plainly. He asked her on a Saturday afternoon at the canyon overlook, where they had gone for the second time since that first visit in the spring. They stood on the limestone shelf with the canyon below them and the October sky a deep clear blue above, the air finally cool enough to be comfortable. He did not kneel, which felt like theater. He stood facing her with the canyon light on both of them and said, "I want to stay in Salvation Creek. I want to stay with you. I want to build something permanent, the kind that has a house and a name over a door and a life inside it, and I want to build it with you. Will you marry me, Belle?" She looked at him for a moment, the direct, reading look, and her eyes were bright, which he had only seen once before on a difficult subject, and she said, "Yes. August, yes. I've been waiting for you to stop thinking about asking me and just ask me." He laughed out loud, surprised into it, and she laughed too, and he pulled her to him and held her with the canyon spread below them, and the Texas sky enormous above, and felt, with the completeness of something finally resolved, that he was home. The engagement was not a secret for long, given the dimensions of Salvation Creek's social landscape. Mrs. Patricia Downing was, apparently, the first to hear, and she received the news with the satisfaction of someone whose predictions have been confirmed. And by evening the information had made its way through the saloon, the church, and Mary Ashton's establishment with impressive efficiency. The wedding was planned for December, not the anniversary of the raid, which both August and Belle had noted when planning, but the weekend before, which felt like planting something good in a difficult month rather than letting the month belong entirely to sorrow. August wrote to his father again, and this time the letter was shorter and the content was simpler. He had a plan to be married in December, and he wanted his father there. He also, he wrote, needed to settle something in himself before the wedding, and he was going to write a separate letter to the county courthouse in Lubbock requesting information on the trial date for the Dorado crew members in custody, because he intended to submit a written statement on behalf of his brother and his family, and to have that piece of justice done properly before he stood up in a church. He wrote the statement over 3 evenings at the desk in his Hartley's room, careful and precise, stating facts, naming Thomas as Thomas, and not as a victim, but as a person with 23 years of specific life. He sent it to the courthouse by mail and received a confirmation that it would be entered into evidence at the trial scheduled for January. That was sufficient. He had done what he could do through legitimate means, and he left the rest to Marshal Holly's and the territorial courts. Ezra Lockhart arrived in Salvation Creek on the Thursday before the wedding, riding the stage from Abilene with a suit that had been pressed with evident care, and a small bundle that turned out to contain the preserved wedding portrait of his wife and Thomas's father, which he gave to August without ceremony, and with only the statement that it belonged with family. Belle met Ezra with the same direct simplicity she brought to everything, shook his hand, asked him 3 questions about the ride that showed she was actually interested in the answers, and then took him straight to the back room of the store and sat him down with coffee and plum preserve on toast, which Ezra tasted and then sat down and looked at her with an expression of surprised respect. "This is better than I expected," he said. "I know," she said, without false modesty. Ezra looked at his son, who was standing in the doorway trying not to smile. "She's honest," Ezra said. "Yes," August said. "Good," Ezra said, and that appeared to conclude the evaluation. He and George Conley, meeting that evening for supper, discovered within 20 minutes that they had mutual acquaintances from the Missouri migration years and a shared opinion on cattle pricing, and by the end of supper were in the middle of an argument about winter feed strategies that both of them were clearly enjoying enormously. Belle sat next to August at the supper table and watched their 2 fathers argue about hay, and looked at August with the luminous expression that he had learned was her particular version of joy, and he put his hand over hers on the table and felt the warmth of it. The wedding was on a Saturday in December, and Salvation Creek, which had been waiting for it with the particular investment that small communities have in their members' major events, produced a version of itself that was decorated and warm and full of people who genuinely meant well. The church was crowded. Mrs. Downing wept without embarrassment. Domingo from the livery had polished his boots. Coleman Briggs and 3 of the ranch hands sat in the 3rd row looking scrubbed and uncomfortable in their good clothes. George Conley walked Belle down the aisle and managed to keep his composure until he sat down, at which point Ezra Lockhart, sitting beside him, quietly passed him a handkerchief and did not make eye contact, which George was grateful for. August stood at the front of the church and watched Belle come toward him in a dress that was deep blue, the color of good sky, and a calm, direct expression that he recognized as the face she wore when she had decided something fully and had no remaining doubts. She was beautiful with the specific beauty of herself, not arranged or performed, just her, entirely and exactly. The minister, A young, earnest man named Reverend Cross, who had been in Salvation Creek for 2 years and had the optimistic energy of someone still surprised by his own calling, asked them to speak their vows, and they spoke them clearly, looking at each other. And when August said, "I do," it was with the full weight of everything he meant by it. And when Belle said, "I do," it was with the same. He kissed his wife in front of their families and their town, and felt the solid rightness of the moment like the ground after a long time on horseback. The reception was held at Hartley's, which had been considerably improved for the occasion by someone hanging every lantern Salvation Creek collectively owned from the ceiling. Mary Ashton had provided the wedding cake, which was the best thing she had ever made by general consensus, and there was dancing that went until 11 o'clock, which was late by the standards of the community and a tribute to how thoroughly everyone was enjoying themselves. August danced with his wife 4 times, which was not scandalous at one's own wedding, and once with Belle's old friend Clara, who was visiting from a neighboring town, and once, memorably, with Ezra Lockhart, because the fiddle player struck up a reel that Ezra knew from his Missouri days, and he grabbed August's arm with the insistence of a man who had decided to be happy for one evening. And they danced badly, and with great energy, and George Conley laughed so hard at the sight of it that he had to sit down. Belle stood at the edge of the dancing area and watched her husband and her father-in-law dancing a reel with matching expressions of concentrated effort, and she laughed, the open, full laugh that had started everything, and August, catching sight of her laughing, felt the joy of it rise in him clean and complete, the purest version of the thing he had thought he had lost. They had a small house. It was not new. It had been the residence of a family who had moved north the previous spring, and it needed work, which August had been doing steadily through November in the evenings, repairing the porch boards and the south-facing window and the kitchen shelf that had come loose from the wall. Belle had whitewashed the interior and hung curtains that she made from the blue calico, which August had helped her select with the specific private humor of 2 people who share a particular history with that fabric. They settled into the house and into each other with the ease of people who had already been building toward this for months, who knew each other's rhythms and requirements and found them compatible. She opened the store at 7. He rode out to Briggs's ranch. They met in the evenings over supper that they took turns preparing, and after supper they sat by the fire and she read and he mended equipment or worked on something practical, and the room was full of the comfortable sounds of 2 people living their life. He wrote to the courthouse in January and received confirmation that the trial of the Dorado crew members had concluded in 3 days of proceedings, and that both men had been sentenced to 15 years in the territorial penitentiary. He sat with that information for an evening, and then folded the letter and placed it with his brother's things in the small box he kept under the bed, and told Belle that evening what it said. Thomas would have had something funny to say about 15 years, August said. What do you think he would have said? August considered it. He would have said that he hoped the food in prison was better than the food he'd been eating lately, and then he would have told everyone that the bar was very low. Belle looked at him. He sounds like someone I would have liked. He was, August said. You would have liked him. He would have adored you. She came and sat beside him on the bench by the fire and leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat with Thomas's memory between them in the warm room, and it was sad, but it was not only sad, which was a change that had been happening so gradually he had not entirely tracked it until this moment. Thomas would have liked that you laughed again, Belle said quietly. He would have been insufferable about it, August said. He would have reminded me of it daily for years. Good, she said. Spring came back to Salvation Creek and the world turned green at its edges again. August was offered the foreman position at Briggs's ranch for the 2nd time, and this time he discussed it properly with Belle, who pointed out that the wage was significantly better and that the additional income would be useful if they intended, as they did intend, to expand the Conley goods store to include a small hardware section that would serve the growing rancher clientele more effectively, an expansion that would require capital. He took the foreman position. The work was demanding and he was good at it. He had a particular quality with animals and with the ranch hands, a combination of consistent fairness and clear expectation that earned him the kind of respect that did not need to be enforced. Coleman Briggs told him 6 weeks in that he was the best foreman he had hired, which August accepted with the modesty of a man who was simply doing the work. The hardware expansion at Conley's Goods opened in June, and the response from the surrounding ranches was better than expected. George Conley, who had been slightly skeptical of the timing, was won over within 2 weeks by the evidence of the ledger, and he said so directly, which was high praise from George. Belle ran both sections of the store with the same effortless precision with which she had always run the goods side, and she hired a young woman named Ada Garrett to help with the shop floor, which gave her time to manage the accounts and the supplier relationships that the expanded operation required. Ada was 17 and quick and good with people, and Belle was a demanding but fair teacher, which Ada apparently thrived under, because within 3 months she had mastered the inventory system and was trusted to open the store on the mornings Belle needed to be elsewhere. August and Belle went to visit Ezra Lockhart in September, the first time August had taken Belle to see where he had come from. The ride was 4 days, and they traveled in a wagon because it was more comfortable for the length of the journey, and because Belle insisted on bringing a jar of plum preserve for Ezra, and possibly also because the wagon permitted them to carry the kind of provisions for a comfortable journey that 2 people who had settled their lives properly tended to accumulate. Ezra met them on the porch of the rebuilt house and shook August's hand and then turned to Belle and said, "You've done something good with him." "He mostly did it himself," Belle said. "I provided the location." Ezra laughed, which August had not heard enough of in recent years, and said, "Come inside, I've cooked something. God help us all." They spent 4 days with Ezra, who was better than he had been in December, not recovered, not whole, but upright and engaged and present. He and Belle had the kind of conversations that August observed from the periphery with quiet happiness. Conversations that were wide-ranging and frank, and occasionally argumentative in the way of 2 people who both have strong opinions and enjoy the process. Ezra showed Belle where Thomas's name had been carved into the porch post. He had done it himself, he said, because he wanted it marked somewhere permanent, and Belle put her hand on the carving and stood quietly for a moment and then looked at Ezra and said, "He sounds like he was wonderful." Ezra looked away at the prairie for a moment and then back at her. "He was," he said. "He was the easy one. August was the serious one. Thomas kept us all from taking everything too seriously." He paused. "I'm glad August found someone who can do that now." Belle glanced at August across the porch. "I fell off a step stool and dropped a bolt of fabric on my own head and he laughed," she said with complete composure. Ezra stared. Then he started laughing, the kind of laughing that has to run its course before it can be contained, and August stood against the porch post and felt the warmth of it spread through the whole scene like afternoon light. "That," Ezra said when he had composed himself, "is the best thing anyone has told me in years." They left on a bright October morning, and Ezra stood on his porch and watched them go, and August turned back once and saw his father standing straight against the house he had rebuilt himself, and lifted his hand, and Ezra lifted his, and that was a kind of completion. The news came in the spring of 1875, 2 springs since August had first ridden into Salvation Creek, that Belle was expecting a child. She told him in the early morning before the store opened, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, in the matter-of-fact tone she used for important information. He sat across from her and looked at her for a moment and then got up and came around the table and crouched beside her chair and took her hand, and she looked at him with the luminous expression, the particular joy that was hers. "You're going to be a father," she said. "Yes," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady, which he did not try to manage. "Are you frightened?" He thought about it. "Yes," he said honestly, "and very glad." "That's the correct answer," she said. George Conley, told the same evening, sat down in his armchair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment and then looked at his daughter and said, "Your mother would have been," and stopped. and then started again. "I am very happy," he said. "I am very, very happy." The pregnancy went well through the summer, which was the summer that the railroad survey crew came through and assessed Salvation Creek and pronounced it a viable stop, which sent the town into the kind of productive frenzy that involves several competing visions of the future and a great many meetings. August attended the town meetings in his capacity as a known rancher foreman with opinions about cattle shipping costs, and Belle attended them in her capacity as someone with opinions about everything. And together, they were reasonably influential in the discussions that shaped the town's position on the railroad terms. The baby arrived in November, a boy, born on a cold, clear morning with the help of a midwife named Mrs. Flores who had delivered half the children in the county and was accordingly unflappable through the whole proceeding. August waited in the other room with George Conley, both of them doing nothing useful with great concentration, until Mrs. Flores opened the door and said, "A healthy son, Mr. Lockhart. Your wife is doing well." August went in and found Belle sitting up in the bed looking tired and entirely herself, with a small person wrapped in a blanket in her arms. She looked up at him as he came in, and she had been crying, the good kind, the kind that happens at the beginning of things. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held his son for the first time, small and definite and warm, and felt something settle in him that completed a long process he had not been able to name while it was happening. "What do we name him?" Belle asked. He had been thinking about this. He looked at his son's face, the closed eyes, the particular newness of him. "Thomas," he said, "with your permission, Thomas George Lockhart." Belle put her hand over her mouth for a moment, and then she said, "Yes," and it was both quiet and enormous. Thomas George Lockhart grew through his first year with the particular determination of a small person who has decided that the world is interesting and that he intends to investigate all of it. He had his mother's amber-brown eyes and his father's dark hair, and a laugh that arrived early and stayed. He was, by all accounts, the easiest baby who had ever come through Salvation Creek, which George Conley said was a matter of excellent breeding, and Mrs. Downing said was a matter of good parenting, and Mrs. Flores said was simply good luck, which was its own kind of blessing. Ezra Lockhart came for a visit when Thomas was 3 months old, and held his grandson with an expression that August had not seen on his father's face since before the raid. The specific look of a man who has been given back something he thought the world had taken entirely. He sat in the front room of the Lockhart house with the baby on his knee for most of an afternoon, talking to him in the low, steady voice of a man who understood that he was in the presence of continuance. He told August that evening on the porch that he thought he might consider the journey to Salvation Creek more regularly, perhaps seasonally, if that was acceptable. "It's more than acceptable," August said. "You're always welcome." Ezra looked at the evening sky, the Texas sky, the same enormous sky that spread over everything regardless of circumstance. "You know what Thomas would say," he said. "The original Thomas." "What?" "He would say that it took you long enough to find happiness, August, and that he wants full credit for the fact that your horse threw a shoe in the right town." August looked at the sky and let the familiar grief be there, alongside the warmth, alongside the sound of Belle inside the house singing something low and tuneless to Thomas George in the kitchen, alongside the smell of wood smoke and the cooling evening air. "He'd be right," August said. Ezra nodded. "He usually was," he said, "about the things that mattered." The railroad arrived at Salvation Creek in 1876, which changed everything and nothing. The town grew, new faces arrived, commerce expanded, and Mary Ashton's dining establishment expanded into a proper restaurant with 3 tables and a menu, which she announced with the pride of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Conley's Goods added a second building for the hardware section and hired 2 more people, and August Lockhart, who had proved himself enough that Coleman Briggs offered him a partnership stake in the ranch, accepted it and became part owner of what was now called Briggs and Lockhart Ranch, which shipped cattle on the new rail line at prices that would have been impossible to imagine 4 years prior. Belle, at 27, was one of the most respected business people in the growing town, consulted on trade decisions, trusted by the ranching families for miles around, known for the combination of honesty and acuity that she brought to every transaction. She had also, by this point, developed a correspondence with a women's suffrage organization operating out of Kansas, which she discussed with August without apology and with great detail, and which August found admirable in the specific way of a man who has married a woman of conviction and finds that it makes him sharper and better than he would be otherwise. She was expecting their second child by autumn of 1876, which she announced with the same matter-of-fact directness as the first time, and August received the news with the same combination of joy and slight anxiety that he expected would attend this particular piece of information for the rest of his life, however many times it arrived. Thomas George was 2 years old by then and had become a definitive person, persistent, cheerful, with opinions about food and a particular attachment to a wooden horse that August had made for him during a slow winter week. He called his grandfather George Papa George and Ezra Lockhart Papa Ez, which neither grandfather found anything other than entirely acceptable. The second child arrived in February of 1877, a girl this time, born in the same cold morning fashion as her brother, but with considerably more vocal objection to the whole process, which Mrs. Flores said was a good sign. Belle looked at August over the baby's head and said, "This one has opinions." "She comes by them honestly," August said. They named her Martha, for Belle's mother, and she grew into the name, a person of strong preferences and consistent energy who kept Thomas George in a perpetual state of cooperative chaos from the time she learned to walk. August Lockhart, who had not laughed since before the raid, who had ridden into a small Texas town on a horse with a broken shoe and a broken life, and found a woman on a step stool failing to reach a bolt of fabric, found himself laughing often. At breakfast, when Thomas George put preserves on his eggs on purpose just to see the reaction. At supper, when Belle read him something from the newspaper in the tone she used when the news was particularly foolish. In the evenings, when Martha had worked herself into the kind of comprehensive enthusiasm about something that required the attention of both parents simultaneously, he found himself laughing with ease, the way his brother had always laughed, and he thought sometimes that Thomas would have been delighted by this specifically. That the thing which had cracked August's grief open had been something so entirely undramatic, a woman and a step stool and a bolt of blue calico doing what gravity always does. 5 years after that December morning when he had turned left instead of right, August stood on the porch of the house he and Belle had expanded to accommodate their family, a proper porch now, with 2 chairs and a view of the main street and the canyon rim beyond, and watched Salvation Creek move through its morning. Thomas George was running toward the livery to see Domingo, who had taken a grandfather-level interest in both Lockhart children and always had something worth showing them. Martha was visible through the window, engaged in some project at the kitchen table that involved considerable concentration and a quantity of paper. Belle came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one, and stood beside him looking at the same view. She was 29 years old and still entirely herself, still direct and sharp and warm, still running the store with the efficiency of someone who had built it with her own hands and knew every corner of it, still reading every piece of print that came through Salvation Creek and having opinions about all of it. She put her head against his shoulder, which she did sometimes in the mornings when the day had not yet made its demands, and he put his arm around her, and they stood together with their coffee in the early light. "Thomas George is going to try to ride one of Domingo's horses today," she said. "He's 6. He's been negotiating with Domingo for 3 weeks. Domingo is going to let him with supervision because Domingo has no resistance to negotiation. He gets that from you. "He absolutely does," she said with satisfaction. Down the street, Thomas George had reached the livery and Domingo had appeared in the doorway, and even at this distance August could see the specific arc of his son's arms that indicated a persuasive argument in progress. He shook his head and felt the laughter come up easily, without effort, the most natural thing in the world. Belle tilted her face up to look at him, and he looked down at her, and what passed between them in that moment was the accumulated weight of everything. The raid and the grief, and the long directionless riding, and the step stool, and the calico, and the left turn, and the canyon overlook, and the years of evenings, and the plum preserve, and Thomas and Ezra, and the two children making the world noisier and more particular every day. All of it carried quietly in the ordinary morning. In the coffee and the porch and the view of the town. "Happy?" she said. "Yes," he said, the same answer he had given Ezra on the porch in September, but fuller now, more certain, the answer that had grown into itself over time the way things do when they are real. She nodded, as though this was the expected and satisfactory answer, and turned back to the street, and they stood together and drank their coffee and watched the morning come in over Salvation Creek, over the canyon and the plains and the enormous unchanged Texas sky. And August Lockhart, who had once feared that joy had left him entirely, found that it had simply been waiting in a town he had not been looking for, in a woman on a step stool. In the ordinary, irresistible fact of a laugh that came up without his permission and changed everything after all. George Conley's plum preserve was declared, at the Salvation Creek Autumn Fair of 1878, to be the finest in the region, winning the prize against 11 other entrants, which George received with the dignity of a man who has always known this to be true and is pleased to have the matter formally resolved. Belle made a speech on his behalf that was brief and pointed, and that ended with the observation that her father had been making this preserve since 1859, and anyone who doubted its quality had simply not yet had the pleasure, which drew the only standing ovation the Salvation Creek Autumn Fair had ever produced for a fruit preserve award. August stood at the back of the crowd with Thomas George on his shoulders and Martha holding his hand, and he watched his wife at the front of the gathering holding the blue ribbon and laughing, and George Conley beside her looking simultaneously modest and triumphant, and Ezra Lockhart too rose in from August, applauding with the genuine enthusiasm of a man who had found his way back to applauding things. Thomas George, from his position on August's shoulders, said, "Papa, why is Mama laughing?" "Because your grandfather's plum preserve won a prize," August said. "Did it deserve to win?" "Absolutely," August said, "without question." Thomas George considered this solemnly. "Good," he said. "I like the preserve." "So do I," August said. Martha tugged his hand. "Papa, can we have some now?" "After supper," he said. "That's very far away," she said, with the specific grievance of a 4-year-old confronting the temporal distance between now and supper. He picked her up with his free arm, which left him carrying both children simultaneously, which was a feat he had become practiced at in recent years, and she immediately began explaining all the reasons why preserves should be available continuously and without restriction, which was a position he found philosophically interesting if practically untenable. Belle caught his eye across the crowd and saw the full situation, both children, the ongoing preserve argument, his expression of patient engagement, and she laughed again. The same laugh that had started everything on a morning in a goods store when the calico fell and the world shifted. And August Lockhart laughed back at his wife across the gathered people of Salvation Creek on a bright autumn afternoon, and felt entirely, completely, specifically alive. Which was, he thought, precisely what it felt like to be home. Ezra Lockhart moved to Salvation Creek the following spring, settling into a room at the expanded Hartley's establishment, which had grown into a proper hotel in the railroad years. He said it was for the climate, which was not entirely false. He said it was to be useful to Briggs and Lockhart Ranch, which was partly true. Everyone understood that it was for the grandchildren, which was the entire truth, and which nobody said out loud because Ezra's dignity did not require it. He sat with Thomas George most evenings on the porch of the Lockhart house, telling him stories of Missouri and the early Texas years and things that had happened before the boy was born. And Thomas George listened with the absorbed attention of a child who understands instinctively that old people have stories worth having. Martha sat between them and asked questions at regular intervals that derailed the stories in directions nobody had anticipated, which Ezra found genuinely delightful, and which Thomas George bore with the resigned patience of an elder sibling who has accepted his circumstances. August came home from the ranch in the evenings to find this scene on his porch, his father and his children in the last light, his wife inside the house completing the final accounts of the store day with the lamp lit and the window warm, and he stopped, some evenings before going inside, just to look at it. He had come to this town broken, on a horse with a bad shoe, going nowhere, unable to laugh, carrying December like a stone in his chest. He had found a woman who fell off a step stool and saw no reason to be embarrassed about it, and who looked at him with amber-brown eyes that read him clearly from the first morning. He had found a town that absorbed him without ceremony. He had found his way back to his father and to himself, and he had built, from the scattered material of a life that had come apart, something whole and good and continuing. Thomas Lockhart, the first Thomas who had laughed at everything and kept them all from taking themselves too seriously. August believed, in the quiet, private way of a man who does not make such statements aloud but holds them, that his brother would have looked at this porch and these children and this evening, and said something funny and absolutely true about how it had all come to pass, and then he would have been glad. August was glad. He was glad with the depth that comes from having known the absence of it, from having ridden through months of gray emptiness and come out the other side into this specific warmth. He was glad for the broken shoe and the left turn. He was glad for the step stool and the blue calico. He was glad for the woman who laughed at herself and saw him clearly and said yes when he asked her to stay, and yes again later when he asked her something larger. He opened the door of his home and went inside to his family, and the door closed behind him on the evening, and in the west the Texas sky burned itself out in all its ordinary, extraordinary colors, and Salvation Creek settled toward night, and the world, as it always had, continued on beautiful and indifferent and full, nonetheless, of everything that mattered.